Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's live webinar. Today we're going to be talking about lessons learned from the 2025 Worldwide EQA scheme for molecular testing of BRCA and other HRR genes variants in breast, ovarian and prostate cancers. This is a non-promotional webinar. It's organised and funded by AstraZeneca and Merck Sharp and Dohme, MSD. Next slide, please. Today it's going to be myself and my co-chair, Professor Sandy Deans from GenQA, who are going to be presenting this webinar to you. Next slide, please. And just to give you a feel for what we're going to be covering, so we're going to be covering the results of the EQA from last year, so the 2025 EQA schemes. There were 3 EQA schemes that we will be discussing for germline testing, somatic testing and ctDNA testing in prostate cancer. We're going to give you an example of some of the common errors and pitfalls we've seen through these EQAs. There are some common themes there. Practical solutions which we hope you can implement or use to help prevent or rectify common errors that you may see in your laboratory. And finally, some guidance and reporting within different clinical contexts. We've also, and most importantly, got a Q&A session at the end, so 20 minutes allocated for answering your questions and answers. Please do use the functionality, the Q&A functionality on Zoom to raise your questions. And finally, we'll summarise and close. And all being well, should take us about 90 minutes to complete today's webinar. So please do stay around for the final, particularly for the questions and answers, because that's, from my perspective and from Sandy's, a really important part of what we're trying to do in terms of live feedback to you, the laboratories. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sandy, who's going to do the rest of the introductions. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Simon. Next slide, please. So Simon says that it's myself and Simon presenting today, but really it is we're here on behalf of both teams at EQA and GenQA, whereby it's a whole raft of individuals who help deliver the EQAs to you and perform the assessments as well. Next slide, please. So some housekeeping before we start. So your microphone's been automatically muted, and that's just to avoid the background noise. The webinar is being recorded, and we will aim to make this available to yourselves on both the EQA and the GenQA YouTube channels after today, probably about in a month's time, but you'll be notified when that's available. And as Simon says, we really want to hear from you, so please do submit your questions at any time during this session, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them when we get to the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So as Simon says, we are delivering this to feedback on the 2025 EQA, and really that's because the feedback we are receiving from yourselves is that these webinars are incredibly useful. So please do take a time after the webinar when you receive an email and with a link to just complete a short feedback survey. And that means that we can then continue to deliver webinars that cover content that you are interested in. Thank you. Next slide, please. These are our disclaimers. Next slide, please. So we're going to now present, as Simon said, the results of 3 of the EQAs that we delivered in 2025. We're going to go through the results and some of the common errors and pitfalls, and really try and flag some of the themes that were recognised during the assessment and the reporting of the EQA summary at the end of the EQA runs. So next slide, please. This is, as you will well be aware, a collaboration between 2 of the genomic external quality assessment providers, so that's EQA and GenQA. We've been delivering these 3 EQAs for quite some time now, so in fact it's 10 years that we've been delivering both the germline and the somatic format of BRCA1, BRCA2 testing in ovarian cancer. And it's now also the 4th time we've run the EQA scheme for somatic HRR gene testing in prostate cancer. This is all of these schemes are supported by an educational grant from MSD and AstraZeneca. So they all provide 3 samples for testing, and we also provide corresponding clinical case scenarios, and that's to support the interpretation and the reporting of these cases. So we ask the participants to test and report using your routine protocols. There's no need for us to assess any changes you make to your routine approach, because that doesn't actually reflect what you deliver to your service. Excuse me. What we do want to do is actually assess what you do for your clinical service, and that gives the value back to you. We are very privileged to be working with a great team of assessors. We have 34 now from 12 countries, and we assess against, excuse me, standardized, harmonized marking criteria. Next slide, please. So the main principles are we can benchmark and compare the results that are submitted by our participating laboratories, because everyone is provided with the same material for testing and the same clinical case scenarios. The results are returned to each scheme for assessment, and we look at genotyping accuracy, interpretation, and also the clerical accuracy of the report. And really, as I've mentioned, we want you to treat these samples in the same way as you would a clinical referral, so a patient sample. The EQA results are scored, and we feed this back both through an individual laboratory report and a general EQA summary report. So the benefits of participating in these EQAs is you get an external measure of the quality of the service that you are providing to your service users. And also it gives a mechanism by which we can provide continuous education and training and help you identify potentially where there's unmet training need within your laboratory. However, the performance monitoring is very important as well, and there are many key stakeholders that recognise EQA data as can bring some value. So, for example, regulators, commissioners and service users do look at EQA performance, and if necessary, either suspend the testing activity if there are issues there on performance, or potentially not use that service. We have applied performance monitoring to all of the schemes that we are talking about today, so all three of them. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to hand back to Simon, who's going to give you a summary of the findings from the germline EQA.
Thank you, Sandy. Next slide, please. Okay, so as Sandy said in the introduction, this is an EQA scheme that's been running for 10 years, so it's very well established, and you can see the data on the left-hand side for the number of laboratories that have been participating. We, as always, break out the data based on whether there are existing laboratories that we have participated previously, at least once in that 10-year period, or whether they're new laboratories who've never participated at all. And I think the key point from this is that the number of laboratories this year did drop, and this may be a reflection of the reduced amount of funding that's been provided to support this EQA, and also that the demand is still there, and the number of laboratories that had previously participated is slightly higher from last year. So it's good to see that those labs are coming back to us, and as we have talked about many times before, there is very good evidence to show repeated participation does improve performance over time. Looking at the breakdown of the regions where laboratories are participating from, you can see the three pie charts on the right-hand side. The standout message here, I think, is that there's been a significant drop in laboratory participation from China, but that's been compensated by increases in participation from the Middle East and Africa, from the Asia Pacific region more widely, and from North and South America in general. So there's been a balancing act, if you like, so that those laboratories from China have been compensated by increases in participation from other regions in the world. And that's great to see. Obviously, we'd like more of the laboratories in China participating, but it's good to see other regions being reached with this EQA, and shows that it really is truly a global EQA scheme covering this type of testing. Next slide, please. So in this EQA scheme, and this is a format you'll see replicated for all three feedback sessions, we provided 3 genomic DNA samples where we had DNA extracted from lymphoblastoid cell lines that we have in-house from our EMQN cell bank in Manchester. We selected those samples based on known specific variants. So we've tested these samples before, and in fact, in many cases, we may well have used them previously in an EQA scheme. So therefore, we have lots of data on there on the variants and how laboratories test them. And each sample, as per routine analysis of these types of EQA, was independently validated before we sent them out to the laboratories. In this case, we used two different laboratories using NGS strategies, slightly different NGS strategies, and both of them included CMV analysis. Again, you can see that the laboratories used different CMV calling analyses. One used NGS and one used an orthogonal method using MLPA. And finally, in all cases, the laboratories confirmed those pathogenic variants using an orthogonal method, in this case, Sanger sequencing. Next slide, please. So looking at the different case scenarios and the feedback from that, first case was a female born in 1954 who'd been diagnosed with pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma, which had metastasized to her liver. She'd been treated by platinum-based chemotherapy about 6 months before and was stable and had stable disease subsequently. She had a potential family history of pancreatic cancer, and she was being considered for PARP inhibitor therapy. So the rationale we used for this case was metastatic cancer, received chemotherapy, and PARP inhibitor therapy was being considered. So the question we're asking is there a pathogenic variant present in the germline DNA? Next slide, please. So we expected laboratories to find a heterozygous BRCA2 variant. And looking at the analytical results, that is genotyping the laboratories submitted, the vast majority of laboratories, nearly 99% of laboratories, got the result correct. There were 3 critical genotyping errors, so a 1.4% error rate. 1 false negative error, so the lab failed to report that heterozygous variant in BRCA2, and 2 false positive results, whereby 1 laboratory incorrectly reported a deletion of 2 exons in BRCA2, and 1 reported duplications of both BRCA1 and BRCA2. Next slide, please. Looking at the interpretation of the results, so again, just like the first case, the vast majority, 99%, nearly 100% in this case, got the interpretation correct. So that's great to see. There was 1 critical interpretation error where the laboratory incorrectly associated this BRCA2 variant with Lynch syndrome. So a familial cancer syndrome, but in this case, the wrong diagnosis, and therefore that lab incurred a critical interpretation error. So overall, a relatively straightforward case 1, and the vast majority of laboratories got the right results correct. Next slide, please. So moving on to case 2. In this case, it was a male born in 1966 who had castration-resistant metastatic prostate cancer. He'd received both hormone treatment and chemotherapy and was being considered for further treatment using PARP inhibitor therapy. Because there was insufficient tissue available for somatic testing, testing of his germline DNA had been requested. So in this case, the rationale was a prostate cancer setting rationale, metastatic setting, and a patient who'd already had hormone treatment and chemotherapy. Again, we were asking the question, is there a pathogenic variant present in his germline DNA? Next slide, please. So looking at the analytical results, so this one was considerably more problematic. So we were expecting laboratories to detect a heterozygous deletion of exons 14 to 16 in BRCA2. But there were quite a lot of laboratories that failed to do so. So in fact, there were 17 genotyping errors in this case. One of them related to a laboratory just failing to state what gene it tested, and of course, in the context of this test, it's really important to state whether it's BRCA1 or BRCA2. There was a conflicting result reported by 1 laboratory where they stated 2 different things in the report, and it wasn't clear what was the correct result and what wasn't. So again, just a sort of, if you like, a reporting process that's gone wrong effectively. 2 laboratories made errors associated with incorrect genomic coordinates. So 1 laboratory reported the correct exons for the variant description, but the incorrect coordinates on the results table. So in the results table, they described a much larger out-of-frame deletion. So again, just inconsistencies in the result they're reporting back to the end user. And another laboratory incorrectly reported a different BRCA2 variant. There was one false negative result, so a laboratory failed to find that heterozygous deletion, and also one false positive result. So a laboratory incorrectly reported a duplication in BRCA2, so the wrong type of CNV. Next slide, please. So when we break this down, the key learning points from this case is obviously a much more challenging case. But we included this case, like we have done, I think, for the last 4 years, a copy number variant into the analysis, because copy number variants account for more than 15% of all inherited BRCA1 and BRCA2 variants, and therefore it's clinically relevant to perform this type of testing. So this case, as it has been in 4 years, has been really, we always try to include or consider the inclusion of a CNV in the analysis. To highlight the importance of testing CNVs in this context. So there were 77% of laboratories correctly reported the result, and 14%, 17 of those laboratories made a critical genotyping error. It's also unclear in many of the reports whether CNVs have been testing. So it's quite possible that some of the laboratories had actually tested CNVs, but just not clearly defined that in their report. And again, highlighting another area of learning, which we obviously pick up on in the context of the EQA, is that you should really clearly state the scope and the limitations of the test you performed, and whether you performed further testing or whether you recommend further testing if you haven't done it. And in all cases, those laboratories that didn't give this clarity on what they tested and why, particularly with the CNV context, lost marks in the EQA. And finally, there was a small number of laboratories that failed to state the allele frequency. And again, it's important to, in the context of this germline testing, the zygosity should always be reported. In this case, we were looking for a heterozygous deletion of exons 14 to 16 in BRCA2. So this case wasn't handled particularly well, and there is still a significant large number of laboratories not testing for or incorrectly testing for CNVs. So a sort of take-home message, and I'm sure Sandy will iterate it later on, you should be testing for copy number variants in BRCA1 and BRCA2. And if you're not testing for them, you should at least state that very clearly on the report. Next slide, please. Looking at the interpretation, there were a small number of laboratories that made critical interpretation errors, so 2 in this case. So 99% got it right. In both cases, they incorrectly described the variant as a variant of uncertain significance. The deletion provided in this case was clearly an in-frame deletion and not considered to be subject to nonsense-mediated decay. And some laboratories are reporting the deletion to be out of frame and applied incorrect criteria for the classification. Hence the fact they were making mistakes within the context of this. Next slide, please. Finally, looking at case 3. So case 3 was a lady born in 1968 who had been diagnosed with serous ovarian cancer. Her tumour had responded to platinum-based therapy, and testing had been requested to determine further treatment options including using PARP inhibitor therapies. So the rationale for this case was an ovarian cancer case. Chemotherapy response had been seen, and PARP inhibitor therapy was being considered. So again, we're asking the question, is there a pathogenic variant present in her germline DNA? Next slide, please. So looking at the analysis, again, this was like case 1 done very well. There was just one critical genotyping error reported where a laboratory incorrectly reported a duplication of BRCA2. So overall, analytical results very good for this case. Next slide, please. Looking at interpretation, again, the same thing applies. So one critical interpretation error. But in this case, the laboratory incorrectly associated this BRCA1 variant, so a heterozygous variant, with Carney complex. The sample itself had a confirmed BRCA1 pathogenic variant, but Carney complex itself is a multi-system condition caused by constitutional germline pathogenic variants in the PRKAR1A gene. So wrong syndrome associated with a different gene, and then hence why the laboratory got a classification as critical interpretation error. Next slide, please. So overall, looking at the strategies laboratories used, and we see this with every laboratory that participated in this scheme. So there were nearly 200 laboratories, in fact, over 200 laboratories used an NGS-based approach. The vast majority of them used a targeted approach, but there were a small number of laboratories using either clinical or whole exome sequencing, and 2 laboratories used whole genome sequencing. What's really interesting is when you start looking at the different assays used, and on the right-hand side, I'm sorry, it's not very clear, but you can see there were 49 different assays used in this EQA scheme. So a huge number of different assays. So nearly 25% of those, one in 4 laboratories used a different assay. So massive variability, and that, to be fair, is quite reflective of many of the EQAs that either EMQN and or GenQA had run. But it just goes to show the breadth of the different number of tests applicable to this type of test context. Next slide, please. So looking at the scoring, and the scoring reflects what we've talked about previously. So cases 1 and 2 were pretty well done, in fact, very well done overall. And the scores were very close to and close to the maximum score of 2, indicating high levels of compliance and good quality testing. And case 2, which was the CMV case, was obviously much more challenging and a large number of genotyping errors associated with that. And the scoring really just reflects that scenario. So case 2 was the tricky case, and that's what you see in the results. Next slide, please. Looking at the performance trends over time, so this data is showing you the data for all 10 years of the EQA scheme. And in the left-hand side of the graph, you're looking at the participation data broken out by labs that submitted results and those that didn't submit or withdrew from the EQA scheme directly. The take-home message from this year was that the number of laboratories either withdrawing or not submitting results was less than 5%, which is great to see. So the vast majority of laboratories that participated, although there was a lower number in total, nearly all of them submitted results to the EQA scheme. Looking at the assessment scores, you can see the variability of the mean scores for both genotyping and interpretation over time. Again, a reflection of the different scenarios we're providing every year and the context of the questions we're asking laboratories. So we expect to see variability there. When we then look at the critical error rates, you can see that we provided a CNV sample in 4 of the last 5 years. And the genotyping error rate is hovering somewhere around 3.5 to 4%. My take-home message from this, and I think this is what we would expect to see in nearly all of our EQAs. So certainly from an EMQM perspective, the mean error rate across all of our EQA schemes is somewhere between that same figure. So everybody makes mistakes, so we're not expecting to see perfection. And this is an acknowledgement of the fact that the error rate, there is an inherent error rate in all of the EQA tests that we see. But overall, the error rate is consistent despite the inclusion of more tricky samples. And certainly this year was lower than the previous 2 years, which is very good to see. And that data is reflected in the poor performing laboratories. So these are the laboratories we would classify as having made a mistake that could lead to patient harm. The poor performance rate this year was about 8.5%. The vast majority of those laboratories that were classified as poor performers made a mistake in 1 case only, but there's still a small number of laboratories that are making mistakes in either 2 cases and or all 3 cases. So a lessons learned here, hopefully, with respect to the feedback to those labs, is to pick up on those errors and ensure that maybe that particularly those ones who made multiple errors, that they don't make those type of errors in the future. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to hand over to Sandy, who's going to give you the overview of the somatic BRCA testing EQA. Over to you, Sandy.
Great, thank you, Simon. So next slide, please. So these are the demographics and very similar findings to those that Simon have just described for the germline EQA, but I would say that the drop in participant numbers for this current year was much less of an impact than we saw in the germline. And again, I think that reflects the drop is due to the fact that the reduced funding for some laboratories that causes a problem. But I think it's also very promising to see that we still have new labs joining the EQA. So that's great. That shows that there's definitely a need out there. Again, slight change with the participation across the globe, with the Chinese labs dropping considerably down to just about 2% of the participant numbers. But the majority of participants are coming from the European countries, and here you can see it's around just over the half of the participants, 56%, are actually located in the European Union. Next slide, please. So the challenges of delivering an EQA in the somatic sense of setting is different from those in the germline. As you all know, it can be challenging to test formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded tissue, but that is the mainstream of the way that tissue is prepared in pathology. So we need to look at how we can mimic the fact that the material is FFPE-based, and labs have to deal with extraction issues from this type of material. So we need to make sure we can get high-quality DNA from tissue samples that reflects both the difficulties in extraction, but also reflects and mimics what happens with real, true patient material. We also have a lot of different, as we've just seen, laboratories situated in different countries, whereby different testing approach and strategies are applied. So we have to make sure that our EQA is fit for purpose for everyone that wants to participate. So we have some ground rules. We expect both BRCA1 and BRCA2 to be tested and reported. And also we deliver this EQA, as you've seen, in the germline and somatic testing setting, because we have some labs who do tumour first testing and some labs who do germline first testing. So we try to make sure that the EQA is fit for purpose and provide different clinical case scenarios so everyone is assured that their testing strategy is working. We also want to provide a range of different types of variants with different variant classifications. And again, it's about giving that assurance that your full clinical service is being assessed. And we have expert review of classification evidence for our variants that are reported. We also think it's really important that with the somatic scheme, that there's an understanding about potential germline variants being detected. So we include this issue in the marking criteria, and we make sure it's discussed in the EQA summary report and obviously in this webinar. Next slide, please. So the design of the somatic scheme is ability of the participating labs so we want to correctly determine the genotype, interpret the results in response to the clinical referral in a clear and concise format. So we're looking for reports to be presented in such a way to minimise misunderstanding of the results or the interpretation. Correctly use international accepted standard nomenclature, so particularly HGVS nomenclature in this setting, and provide appropriate and accurate patient and sample information and identifiers on the reports. Next slide, please. So the samples that were provided for this run were 3 artificial FFPE cell line samples. They were selected by both EMQN and GenQA in collaboration for specific variants where we wanted to test particular elements of the testing strategies. And post-sectioning of the cell lines and of the FFPE material, samples were independently validated by next generation sequencing before distribution. So we were assured we knew what was in the samples we were sending out. So we had 3 different testing laboratories performing validation for us. One was using a custom QIAGEN targeted DNA panel, and they validated both cases 1 and 2, as did the second laboratory, who used exome sequencing of twist exome and the comprehensive exome probes for, again, cases 1 and 2. And case 3 was slightly different because this was more of a panel-based test with different targets, and this was validated using the Sophia DDM HRD solution and the SEC1 HRD platform. Next slide, please. I think it's also important to say that samples all gave concurrent and as expected results. So they were all able to be moved through to be used for EQA distribution. So I'm now going to go through the 3 cases. So case 1 was Mallory, who had been diagnosed with serous ovarian cancer. So she had previously received platinum-based chemotherapy, which her tumour did respond to, but now she was being considered for maintenance treatment with PARP inhibitors. So we were requesting testing for BRCA1 and BRCA2. So the rationale is ovarian cancer case, which is being considered for PARP inhibitor treatment. So is there a pathogenic variant present in the tumour being tested? Next slide, please. So these are the results. We were expecting no pathogenic variants to be reported in either BRCA1 or BRCA2. As with the germline scheme, we have a very, very high standard of genotyping accuracy, with nearly 98% of participants reporting the correct result. So we did have a small number of critical in genotyping errors, with the incorrect result being reported, and they were all false positive results. So they're listed here. One, we've got a different BRCA1 variant being reported, which actually is the variant that's present in case 2. So we suspect there's been a potential sample swap or data swap in that testing laboratory. We had a laboratory, that was 2 laboratories. We had one reporting BRCA1 deletion and BRCA2 deletion in different exons, which is incorrect. A 4th lab reported a different BRCA1 variant. A different lab reported a BRCA1 deletion, and particularly in exons 22, and another lab reported multiple BRCA1 and BRCA2 variants. So really there's a lot of issues ongoing there, not all the same common theme and not all the same incorrect variant being reported either. However, the standard of interpretation was extremely high, with no critical interpretation errors being reported. Next slide, please. This is the second case. Again, another lady this lady was born in 1947 and has platinum-sensitive serous ovarian cancer. So she's had surgery and received 1 round of platinum-based chemotherapy. And again, like the first case, she's been considered for maintenance therapy with PARP inhibitors. So the question is a pathogenic variant present in her tumour? And we were requesting BRCA1 and BRCA2 testing. Next slide, please. These are the results for the second case. We had no pathogenic variants in BRCA2, but there was a heterozygous pathogenic variant detected in BRCA1. And as with case 1 again, we had a very high standard of genotyping accuracy, with nearly 99% of participants correctly identifying this heterozygous variant. We did have 3 critical genotyping errors. 2 of those were false negatives, so they failed to identify the presence of this BRCA1 variant. And again, as mentioned, we suspect this is a potential swap with the case 1. We also had a false positive who reported, and this laboratory reported multiple BRCA1 and BRCA2 variants in the report. And again, as we saw with case 1, then there were no critical interpretation errors reported. So to note, there were small deductions given for both case 1 and 2 for interpretation, but no critical interpretation errors. Next slide, please. Case 3 is a slightly different, challenging EQA case. This case, it was based on prostate cancer, and this gentleman was being considered for PARP inhibitor treatment. So he had castration-resistant prostate cancer, which had metastasized, and he'd received hormone treatment and chemotherapy. So the reason for testing was we wanted to determine if there was a pathogenic variant present in his tumour in this range of different HRR genes. So we were asking laboratories to test for these genes and report these genes only. We were aware that not everybody has this scope within their clinical service. So their instructions were that testing of BRCA1 and BRCA2 was mandatory and must be tested and reported. And it was impertinent that laboratories didn't feel they needed to set up any tests for genes that they didn't already have a clinical service for. Next slide, please. So these are the expected results. There were no pathogenic variants in BRCA1. There was a heterozygous duplication in BRCA2, and there was a heterozygous, very small deletion in BARD1. So when we were assessing, we had to be very mindful of the scope of the testing that individual laboratories were reporting. So we didn't want to deduct or give a particular laboratory a clinical error if they didn't test for BARD1. So the results were taken into account the scope of the testing provided in the report. We were not able to determine exactly what tests the laboratories were performing if it was not stated clearly on the report. So if BARD1 testing was not performed, then only BRCA1 and BRCA2 results were assessed. If BARD1 testing was performed, then these results would be taken into account and they would have to be correct. This was tested by 135 labs, so roughly 50% of laboratories did include this gene in their test scope. Next slide, please. So with genotyping, we had a considerable number of incorrect results, particularly false negatives. So here we can see we had 45 laboratories failing to report the BRCA2 and the BARD1 variant. So 42 laboratories did not detect the BRCA2 variant. 2 laboratories did not detect the BARD1 variant, despite it being included in their EQA, their testing scope. And 1 laboratory did not detect either of these 2 variants. We also had 4 laboratories reporting false positive results. Again, as we've seen with the previous cases, there is no trend as in particular variants being detected falsely. Different reports, variants reported and different types of variants reported by these 4 laboratories. Next slide, please. So just to go into a bit more detail about why we had such a high error rate, particularly from those 42 laboratories, this variant is located in, this is the BRCA2 variant, was located in a homopolymeric region, so within a very dense repeat region. It was marked correct within the limitation of the test if the report stated that a limitation of detection for variant in homopolymeric regions was included in the report. So it was known to the laboratory that this was a limitation of the testing approach that they took, and that the reader of the report would know that potentially there would be a variant in these problematic regions. 46 laboratories were given critical genotyping errors, as I mentioned, if no suitable limitations of the test were indicated on the reports. In other words, so there was no indication to the reader of the report that these variants in this region would not be detected by the assay performed. Now, of the 43 laboratories that were failed to report this variant, 80% of them stated that they used the Oncomine assays. We know that this is a limitation of the Oncomine testing bioinformatics pipeline, not the assay. So we recommended back to the participants that if they did not detect this variant, to review the bioinformatics settings and that they contact the manufacturer, Thermo Fisher, for advice. And in fact, the EQA providers, GenQA and EMQN, have been in contact and been speaking with Thermo Fisher, and they have been incredibly helpful. It's very important to state that not every laboratory performing these assays did not detect the BRCA2 variant. It's about the bioinformatics, not the actual testing and the assay itself. If you're using the closed box bioinformatics, then if you don't pick up any variants, it's recommended that you go and look at your VCFs to see that there's definitely not any variants present. As with the other two cases in this EQA, there were no critical interpretation errors reported, which is excellent to see. Next slide, please. So we also, though, did see approval of PARP inhibitors for patients with prostate cancer with BARD1 variants is specific to the region and the country. So we've got to be mindful that these are globally delivered EQAs, that not everybody is dealing with the same licensing, the same funding, and also whether or not these PARP inhibitors are available for these types of variants. So we were looking for participants to comment on the PARP inhibitors in relation to the clinical referral provided, and also to comment on referring the patient to clinical genetics. It was noted that this variant, the BRCA2 variant, was also present at nearly 50%. So there was a likelihood that it potentially could be germline. We could not determine that from the testing being performed, but we will be looking for a referral to clinical genetics or some sort of genetic counselling. Next slide, please. So as with the germline scheme, Simon has mentioned that we saw lots of different types of methodologies. Not surprisingly, everyone used a next generation sequencing approach, with the majority using a targeted test and analysis, and 4 laboratories used whole exome sequencing. Now, again, you can see here we've got 56 different assays being used, which just evidences that to state that you use next generation sequencing on your report isn't always sufficient to be able to understand what test was actually performed. Next slide, please. So looking at the scoring summary, I think here you can say that the interpretation was very high with very few critical errors, but with the small number of deductions being applied, only once, if it was the same error across the 3 cases, these were only applied to case 1. Hence, you can see here the purpley colour interpretation on case 1 is slightly lower the mean score than the other 2 cases. And again, as we've just discussed, that the errors in case 3 with that particular BRCA2 variant, that you can see that the mean score for genotyping has dropped considerably compared to the other cases. Next slide, please. Now, looking over the performance trends, as we've just seen with the germline scheme, we are seeing more participants submitting results, which I think is excellent. Potentially, maybe because laboratories are having to pay some of the EQA fees for participation, that they're actually being more committed and want to get the results assessed. So that's excellent. We thank you for that. So there has been a definite increase in the trend of submissions. And then we can see the breakdown here of the assessment scores. Even though they do fluctuate and you can see some drop, it is very much case dependent. But I think you could say that there is a high level of high standard of testing and reporting across the board. The next graph down on the right-hand side in the middle here is our critical error rates. And again, you can see that for the first time, actually, we've got no critical interpretation errors. But we do see a rise again in the critical genotyping errors, which is what we've just described and is dominantly from that one single case. And that also is demonstrated in the bottom graph on the right-hand side, where you can see that increase in the percentage of poor performing laboratories. Although the good news here is there are very few that is affected with more than one case. So I think it's evidence that if we put a particularly challenging EQA case in the run, then it does often impact the performance scores. So that's a summary of the somatic scheme. So now we're going to move on to ctDNA testing prostate cancer. So Simon, I'm going to move on to you, please. So next slide.
Thank you, Sandy. So so this is the summary of the ctDNA testing in prostate cancer. I should probably remove the word pilot. This is not a pilot EQA. Moving forward to the next slide, please. So looking at the demographics, we've only been running this EQA scheme for 4 years, and you can see that about 60 or 2/3 of laboratories are existing laboratories, and 1/3 of laboratories are new. So again, this is not really reflective of the other two established EQA schemes, but it's good to see that there's an increase in the number of laboratories coming back to the EQA every year. Likewise, in the other two EQAs, you can see that again there's been a drop in Chinese participants, and that's been balanced out by increases in laboratories from other regions in the world, with Europe being the main region of participation for this EQA scheme. But again, it's still very much a global EQA scheme. Next slide, please. So the challenges for EQA, this EQA, slightly different again to the previous two EQA schemes. I think the biggest challenge for us as providers of this service is really obtaining high quality materials that you can use in your laboratory. I'm sure you as laboratories recognise this challenge as well, and obtaining these high quality cfDNA materials really means that we are limited to providing materials that are artificial in some way, shape or form, rather than purely patient-derived materials. So we provide a artificial reference material manufactured to our specification by a third party in a plasma-based matrix, because we believe firmly that we're trying to test the whole analytical process. So you've got to be able to extract the DNA in your normal routine way. We also track failure rates to understand whether the materials we're providing are meeting the needs of the laboratories and causing problems with respect to DNA extraction and downstream analysis as well. The good news is that that's not the case. We also need to be sure that we can understand the limitations of ctDNA testing, cfDNA testing, should I say. Again, this is quite different to the two EQAs we reported previously, and often complicated because we're trying to do a very challenging material type with a slightly different test context, and the need to look at variant allele frequency as well. So most laboratories will be using an NGS-based strategy. A problem we've seen repeatedly in the past, but I think is becoming less, is the laboratories previously have used or would have used a test strategy that was based around a strategy that was based around validation of a strategy for FFPE material. But of course, the context here is very different. But this is less of a problem than we have seen in the past, but still a recurring issue from some laboratories. Well, the EQA is also trying to look at the variable experience of interpreting variants. Clearly, variant analysis is a key part of these types of analysis. So we try to provide to you a range of different types of variants and different types of classifications. Again, participating 1 year in an EQA is not sufficient to be able to see the full range of types of samples we would include, evidencing the need for continuous participation in this context. And we use our expert colleagues, our expert assessors, to help us review those classifications to make sure that we're providing you with accurate interpretations of the variants you're testing in the EQA. Finally, let's not forget the importance of germline variants in this type of testing strategy. So again, we include this as part of our context of our assessment. We have it in our marking criteria, and we have already discussed that in the somatic EQA scheme that Sandy's just fed back on, but will, I'm sure, become a theme in this EQA for feedback as well. Next slide, please. So we provided 3 artificial cfDNA samples containing 80 nanograms of cfDNA per mil of sample in a total volume of 3 mils of plasma. All 3 samples were validated independently by 2 different laboratories. One laboratory used an NGS-based strategy using an Illumina TrueSight oncology test with an LOD of 1%, whereas the other laboratory used an MSK Access-powered test with Sophia's DDM platform and an LOD of 0.5%. So 2 different strategies, but again, we're trying to get reflection of what laboratories would do in terms of our validation strategy. And all the samples used in this EQA passed our initial validation, so that's DNA extraction and downstream analysis. Next slide, please. So case scenario. So case 1 was a male sample born in 1954, had been diagnosed with metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer, and had received chemotherapy and hormone therapy. His disease was progressing and there was insufficient tissue available, so that cfDNA testing had been requested because the clinicians were looking at the opportunity to use PARP inhibitor therapy for his treatment. And the rationale for this case was a prostate cancer scenario, progression after first-line hormone and chemotherapy treatment, and insufficient tumor available for somatic testing. So cfDNA testing was required. And the question we were asking is a pathogenic variant present in this sample? Next slide, please. So the vast majority of laboratories got this result right, so 88.5%, so not quite up to the 90% we've seen on the other samples. But we were looking for laboratories to report a pathogenic BRCA2 variant. And in the manufacturing, our specification to the manufacturer, we expected the laboratories to detect a variant at about 9.5% variant allele frequency. The validation laboratories reported very close to this expectation, so we're confident the sample was performing correctly. 2 laboratories reported false positive results. So one reported an incorrect variant in BRCA2, as well as the correct pathogenic variant in BRCA2, and the other laboratory reported 2 variants in addition to the correct variant in BRCA2. There were 3 laboratories that made false negative results, so all of them didn't report that variant, and that led to a critical genotyping error of 11.5%, not the 21.5% here indicated on the graph. I'm sorry, on the chart. So 11.5% of laboratories made a critical genotyping error. Next slide, please. So looking at interpretation, it's good to see there were no critical interpretation errors. 13 laboratories, so 21% of the laboratories, didn't provide enough detail in their report for us to establish what type of variant classification system they'd used. All of those laboratories received a comment, but again, comes to the importance. You really do need to make sure that this information is included in your report. It's possible that this BRCA2 variant could have been germline in origin, so we did expect to see laboratories saying something about that and either referring the patient to clinical genetics or requesting a sample for germline analysis. Of those, 21 laboratories, so 34%, didn't do that, so they received feedback from the assessors, and 2% of laboratories received a deduction because they provided a misleading comment regarding the variant allele frequency, and using the variant allele frequency figure to actually determine whether the variant was somatic or germline in origin. Now, obviously, we are aware that many laboratories do this, but it has to be caveated that it's not a reliable indicator of variant allele frequencies, and it's only a proxy. So if you really do, technical or biological reasons reflect that. So please do make sure you're aware of that and don't use it, but if possible, to actually infer whether a variant is germline or somatic in context. That can only be done by looking at the germline analysis. Next slide, please. So in case 2, we had a male born in 1951 and a very similar case scenario as in case 1. Again, we're asking the question, is there a pathogenic variant present in his DNA? Next slide, please. So there were no critical genotyping errors this time around, so fantastic to see, and also no critical interpretation errors. So really good testing, high quality testing with no significant errors reported by any laboratory. There were 24 laboratories, so just under 40% of laboratories, that didn't discuss the limitations of cfDNA testing when they didn't define a variant. And in all cases, those labs received a deduction because it's important to make sure you state that the analysis of a plasma sample isn't 100% sensitive, and that for multiple different reasons why you might not get 100% sensitivity, including insufficient tumor sample in the plasma, insufficient tumor DNA present in the plasma sample, and therefore you may have missed that variant. So just rein back, if you like, on the statements around on the limitations of the test and how you report that. 14% laboratories, 14 laboratories, 23%, overinterpreted the lack of a clinically actionable variant in the cfDNA and incorrectly suggested there would be no response from PARP inhibitor therapies. So again, the amount of DNA present in the sample may be the reason for a normal result, and confirmatory testing should be suggested on the report. In all cases, these laboratories also received a deduction. And finally, 23 laboratories, so 37%, didn't suggest that repeat testing may be appropriate in this case, either on another cfDNA sample or an alternative tumor biopsy. These laboratories also received a deduction. So again, some key learning here in the context of cfDNA testing that's particularly relevant to cfDNA testing that we hope the laboratories will take home and incorporate in their reporting moving forward. Next slide, please. Finally, case 3. So this was a male born in 1963, and again, the same scenario, rationale, prostate cancer scenario, progression after first-line hormone therapy treatment, and use of targeted therapies has been considered, and cfDNA testing has been requested. Next slide, please. So for case 3, this was done much better than case 2. We were looking for laboratories to report a BRCA1 variant, a pathogenic variant, a small deletion in BRCA1. In this case, the expected variant allele frequency from the manufacturer was around about 22%. The validation laboratories were reporting a slightly lower figure, but even with a figure of 10 to 16%, most laboratories should be able to detect that clinically with their test. So a clear pathogenic variant in BRCA1. Just under 94% of laboratories incorrect reported, so it was done very well. The testing was of very high quality. And there was one laboratory that reported both a false negative and a false positive result. So they didn't report the BRCA1 variant, but they did report a different BRCA1 variant in a completely different region of the gene. There were no critical interpretation errors, as in cases 1, 2, and 3, 1 and 2 as well. Next slide, please. All of the tests used were NGS-based tests, and 32 different assays employed. So if we bear in mind that there were 61 laboratories taking part, 50% of them used a different test. So again, huge variability here, and lots of different manufacturers, emphasizing the point that Sandy made. It's really important to not just state that you used NGS, but to actually state very clearly in the report the actual NGS test that you used. Next slide, please. So looking at scoring, so case 1, there was a very low genotyping error score, and interpretation for all 3 cases was pretty consistent, as was the clerical accuracy. So the data reflect the results from the EQA scheme. Next slide, please. Looking at performance trends, again, although there was a larger number of laboratories that didn't report results for different reasons, there was still a very high number of laboratories, about 85%, that actually submitted a result for assessment. That's the variability in assessment scores is the same as the other EQAs. We expect to see variability over years and between different cases. And looking at the critical error rates, there was a critical or mean error rate this year of about 3.5%. So slightly higher than last year, but within the figure we would expect to see from established EQA. So again, good to see the error rates have come down and no critical interpretation error rates this year, same as the somatic scheme. And the poor performance scores are reflective of that data. All laboratories that received poor performance this year only made a mistake in one case, one of the 3 cases. So overall, we would say that this scheme has been a success. There's been a high quality of testing. We have highlighted some key areas of improvement for laboratories, but overall, most laboratories did a very good job of this EQA this year. Next slide, please. Over to you, Sandy, I think, for the shared learning.
Great, thank you, Simon. So I think it's always surprising that even though we are delivering EQAs for different clinical case scenarios in different settings, that you still get common themes despite germline testing, somatic testing, and cell-free DNA testing all being slightly different ways of delivering a service. So next slide, please. So Simon and I've put together some of the common themes, good things and bad things, that we can discuss now. So we do have lots of positives, and I think we have focused on the critical errors in this discussion today. But I think it's fair to say that there is very, very high level of BRCA testing and other HRR gene testing being provided, and also safe clinical reporting. We also see a really high degree of compliance with HGBS variant nomenclature. Now, this is really important when it comes to sharing data in databases, as our testing is expanding away from hotspot testing and more into genome-wide testing, whereby we do have to determine whether or not somatic variants or germline variants are pathogenic or are disease-causing variants. And I think we need to draw upon shared data to be able to enhance this and make it more accurate. And part of that is being able to speak the same language and know that that variant detected in one lab is the same variant detected in a second lab. And the way to do that is about standardized nomenclature. Following on from that, we also saw a huge improvement in the use of reference sequences. So if there's a gene position, nucleotide nomenclature being used, exon numbering being used, it's really important to use the appropriate reference sequence, gene reference sequence. Particularly important with the BRCA1 and BRCA2, as we know that different transcripts and different versions of reference sequences actually do have different exon numbering. And we've seen that in previous EQAs, how labs can actually get this incorrect. We've also seen an improvement in the reporting format. We have some labs that have very, very long reports. Some labs have very, very concise, nice, easy to read reports. So we want to get that sweet spot whereby you have the enough information, the pertinent information there, but presented in a easy to read way that you can find the result and interpretation of the result without any misunderstanding. Next slide, please. Some of the areas that we see deductions, small deductions across all of the three EQAs are here on this slide. One is variant classification. We're seeing many labs still using ClinVar as just a single source of evidence. Now, there's other databases and guidelines available which are more suited to, for example, somatic validation or actual gene-specific variant classification like Enigma. So we do recommend that you use more than just one source to determine your variant classification. Many labs are still reporting the presence of non-pathogenic variants. So this is your class 1, your class 2 benign, likely benign variants. Often these can be just part of a list along with the pathogenic variants that are being reported. And we find that this can be misinterpreted, and the clinician reading the report or could infer that a pathogenic variant has been detected and it's acted upon. So for safe clinical reporting, we recommend that class 1 and class 2 variants are not included in the report. Obviously, a record will be kept of the presence in the laboratory and can be discussed if required, if appropriate to do so, but we don't recommend they are included. Answering the clinical question asked. So we do provide with all of our EQA cases a clinical case scenario for interpretation within that context. Many labs are still not including a statement about the patient's likelihood of benefiting from targeted therapy. And we're aware that it depends the country or the region or the funding of these services. So we do take into consideration any information that the laboratory provides us when it comes to assessing, but we are looking for a patient-specific statement for interpretation and treatment options. We also see that when clinically relevant variants are not found in a germline sample, then it's really important to recommend testing of the tumour to determine whether or not a somatic variant is present. Next slide, please. The area, as Simon explained earlier, that we do have great concerns about is that the testing scope of laboratories is not sufficient. it is very important that copy number variants, including your large genomic rearrangements, should be included in the test. And that is because we know that 15% of all inherited BRCA1 and BRCA2 variants are down to large genomic rearrangement. So it's really clinically relevant that these should be tested for in these patients. If you don't perform that testing, then we need to make sure that the referring clinician is aware that that testing has not been performed, so that it's a potential area whereby other variants could be present in the patient. So we would recommend that if you don't cover these CMVs in your testing, that your report clearly states that that is a limitation of what has been performed. Next slide, please. So we're pleased to let you know that we will be delivering these 3 EQAs again during 2026. Registration is currently open. You can register through EMQN or GenQA. It's exactly the same scheme that is being delivered. The samples will be sent out in the EQA open in September, and the close will be when the results are due to be submitted by mid-November. And then we will hold our assessment meetings and aim to publish the results in the spring of 2027. Exact dates and timetable are just being confirmed, but please see the websites of EMQN and GenQA for further details if you wish. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for listening to us today. We hope that we've shared some useful information. We now, next slide, would like to ask you to, and next slide, please, submit any questions on the Q&A function that's available here on the Zoom platform. And hopefully we have some coming in, and we've got some time, Simon, to look at them. Do you want to have a look at what's coming in?
Yeah, I've got one question here, Sandy, come in. So it'd be interesting to have an additional slide with the cumulative lab performance results broken down by different approaches used, panel sequencing versus XM, etc., and by whether they're commercial CE-IVDs or LDTs. Be useful for laboratories that are approaching these activities, and also in the light of the IVDR regulation. That's an interesting question, that one. So it is something we have considered in terms of how to break down the types of errors, but it's quite often difficult, and I think Sandy would back me up on this, to actually elucidate sometimes the actual the detailed strategies these tests involve with respect to the approach the laboratory's taken. But we will consider that. That's certainly something we could look at, and whether we can do that across all 3 schemes is possible. We'll consider that in light of the next year's EQA schemes. I totally understand the requirement for highlighting with respect to IVDR, and obviously that's starting to have an impact on laboratories in Europe. So we will consider that. Sandy, have you got any thoughts on that one at all?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that always comes up, that people want to have advice on what potentially is a good test and what's a bad test. I would say that with all poor performance, we do follow up with the laboratories and ask them to perform a root cause analysis, and we provide help and support for those labs. And I would say that it probably demonstrates that it's not necessarily the assay. There can have multiple labs performing the same assay, but all have different issues. So there's always variability. So just because some labs have particular poor performance with one assay doesn't necessarily mean it's the assay at fault, that there's so many variables in there. So I think that's why we've tried to avoid this to date, because it's very difficult to determine that there's an issue with a particular testing strategy, for example.
Yeah, we do include it in some EQAs, and I certainly from EMQM, but I totally understand. It's complex. It's not easy to. You intrinsically look at the poor performance figures, but the poor performance is not a reflection on how the errors are caused. And in most cases, it's usually human error that's the main cause of it, not necessarily a particular strategy. And I mean, I think it's evidence this year that the EQAs do pick up systematic errors with technological approaches, and
Yeah.
that's what we see this year with the particular test in the somatic scheme. And in those cases where that does take place, and they are unusual. As I think that's the first thing to say, as you say, it's much more likely to be random errors. But if we do pick them up, then we will, and we have an obligation as EQA providers to work with the manufacturers to highlight the problems associated with it. So I totally accept what you're saying. I think that's right. And it's difficult. You've got to be very careful when you interpret these EQAs not to over interpret the causes of errors. That's very true.
So we've got another question come in saying screening for CNVs in BRCA1, BRCA2 genes is also recommended for tumour tissue analysis or only for germline analysis? Do you want to answer that one, Simon?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the answer is really it should be doing it for any BRCA1 and BRCA2 test, because the scenario is exactly the same. You still have a high likelihood of picking up variants that are large genetic arrangements or copy number changes in a somatic and or a germline test scenario. Obviously, the technical challenges associated with that are different, and you're dealing with a much more difficult type of test with a formalin fixed paraffin embedded type scenario material type. But nevertheless, your analysis should either include a CNV analysis in the somatic and germline context, or at least referral to a different laboratory and stating clearly the limitations of the scope of your test in your report. So it does apply to both scenarios, yes.
Great, thank you. And potentially, I think if whole genome sequencing becomes more common practice in the somatic setting, you would be using fresh tissue, which would be easier to hopefully determine copy number variants as well. So, we may see a shift rather than having to do an MLPA assay, for example, that's a separate test. So hopefully that will make it easier for laboratories to deliver the full scope.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually very reassured by the quality of testing in the prostate cancer scheme, if I'm being honest, because I think although the sample material type in the somatic scheme is challenging, we're actually providing samples that are probably too high a quality for that EQA, because the samples are homogeneous in the context of where the variant sits. The variant is present in all cells in that material. But in the ctDNA challenge sample, you're dealing with very low amounts of DNA, and also we're requesting laboratories to do complex testing on multiple different genes as well. So the fact that there were relatively few numbers of mistakes made in that scheme is really encouraging to me. I think it reflects that the ctDNA context has improved significantly over time in what can be a very challenging test scenario.
And I think probably that has benefited from other ctDNA testing coming first before, having to tackle prostate samples in particular and the BRCA genes. The labs have got more experience handling, for example, lung testing for the ctDNA and also for resistance mutations in breast cancer now. So I think there's been a lot of learning, a steep learning curve prior to the prostate cancer ctDNA assessment, which has helped.
Yeah, we agree with that entirely. Any other questions from the participants? Or have we wowed you with our presentation? Oh, no, there's one more. That's great to see. Sandy, you've got a question here. So,
yes, this is a good one. Yeah, I can have this one. You
absolutely. I thought it's coming straight to you. So thank you for your presentation. Thank you for listening. We always appreciate that. Have you considered validating EQA samples from African countries?
Yes, we have. And India as well, because there's certain high populations within Indian communities that have particular founder variants there as well. Yes, so we did a series of workshops in South Africa, and this was something that kept coming up and saying that it's fine to participate in some of the EQAs, but a lot of countries not just South Africa, but within Africa, have their own gene pools, and variants are very different. So yes, we have some collaborations that we're setting up. So if you would like to be involved, then please do contact us, because obviously we sometimes are very limited to cell lines that are available or the samples that are available to us. And they do tend to be white Caucasian males, to be fair. And we're trying to build on the ethnicity and the diversity of what we send out. So thank you for that question. It's very pertinent.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges for us as EQA providers, is to make sure our samples are reflective of the geographic diversity of variants, and it is difficult for us to do that, particularly as we're very reliant on generally on cell banks or samples that have been donated to us. So if you're able to support that, please do contact us and help us to move that forward. It'd be gratefully received. I've got another question here, Sandy. Mentioned a couple of times that participation in Chinese laboratories has decreased. Is this due to an equivalent EQA scheme being established in China within the past year? Can I answer that one? Or are you okay with that one?
You answer it. I don't know. There are Chinese EQA schemes available. I think one of the big block is translation and the language barrier. But why it's been decreased, I'm not aware. Do you, Simon?
I don't know for sure, but I think it's multiple different factors. One of them is, you are quite correct, it's language as well. And we are, as EQA providers, trying to ensure that we can assess in multiple languages. I think you'll find that we provide assessment in 6 different languages currently for these EQAs. But secondly, I think it's also the way the funding for these EQAs has changed over the last couple of years means it's harder for Chinese laboratories to pay the EQA providers the fee associated with the participation as well. So there is no, I don't think there's any easy answer to it, and it may also be marketing. It could be restrictions on getting samples to and from China. I don't really have a good handle on the exact reason for that, I'm afraid. Any more questions?
No, nothing coming through.
Nothing coming through? No.
So we go on to the next slide, please.
Yep.
Just to say thank you very much indeed for participating in this webinar today. It's great to see questions come through, and it give us food for thought. So there's some things there, Simon, that we will pick up.
Yep.
Hopefully everyone will find enrolment easy for the next EQAs year for 2026, and we'll be delivering those EQAs and hopefully be back with you afterwards to share some further findings. So next slide, please. Thank you very much for your participation. We go to the next slide.
I think that's the last slide.
So there we go. Yeah. So there's a QR code here and we really encourage you to complete the short feedback form so we can actually take some actions and deliver more educational and interesting webinars to you. So thank you very much from me. And Simon?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed from me as well. Thank you to you, the participants, for joining us today and for participating in the 2025 scheme. Please do register for 2026 if you haven't, via either GenQA or EMQN. And thank you also for the team behind from MSD and AstraZeneca for supporting this EQA and for making this webinar happen. We obviously couldn't do that without you as well, so we're grateful to that support as well. Have a good rest of the day, and we look forward to speaking to you this time next year when we report back on the 2026 EQA scheme. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.